Thank you guys so much for joining. My name is Belen Bonilla. I am the Strategic Engagement Associate here at PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute. We're a nonprofit organization conducting research at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. And this is our first webinar of the summer, so we're really excited that you guys are here. And we're going to be talking about LGBTQ rights across the country, the state of play for LGBTQ rights today, with a really wonderful panel of folks. And this week is actually the 10th anniversary of the Obergefell decision that legalized same-sex marriage from the Supreme Court back in 2015. So lots to think about there. We'll talk more about that in this conversation, but as you guys are joining, feel free to add in the chat where you're joining from. And we've got a quick Zoom poll for you here. What percentage of Americans do you think identify as you? So that is the first question that we have for you today. Let's see, we've got a couple of responses coming in here. 5%, 10%, 15%, or 25% are the options. And all right, I'm going to give you guys a couple seconds. Seems like we've got 10% in the lead, which is correct. 10% of Americans identify as LGBTQ. So while we are kind of thinking more about this topic, I'm going to go ahead and pass things over to our CEO of PRRI, Melissa Deckman, and our other panelists to introduce themselves.
Thank you very much, Belen. I am Melissa Deckman. I'm the CEO of PRRI, or Public Religion Research. We are very delighted to have you join us today for this, what we're calling a Meet the Moment webinar. There's a lot of news and developments when it comes to LGBTQ rights, and we thought this would be a good opportunity to really sort of take a step back to look at some trend data when it comes to attitudes about LGBTQ Americans and rights. And I'm delighted to be joined by really a terrific panel. So on that note, I'd actually like to hand off the introduction to Andrew Flores.
Hi, Andrew Flores, a professor at American University and also an affiliate scholar with both PRRI and the Williams Institute at UCLA.
Hey y'all, I'm Orion Rummler. I cover LGBTQ news at the 19th News. We're a nonprofit newsroom where whenever we cover politics or health, we're focused on the gender angle, which includes LGBTQ folks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelsy Burke. I am a sociology professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and an affiliate scholar with PRRI. I research gender, sexuality, and religion. I'm currently writing a book on the origins and evolutions of the anti-trans movement in the United States.
Terrific. Well, what I'd like to do is really just to set the stage right now with a very brief PowerPoint presentation. For those of you in the audience who follow our work, it probably won't be news to you, but I do think that it's really helpful just to kind of think about trend data when it comes to attitudes about LGBTQ rights. And so we are drawing here from our 2024 PRI American Values Atlas and looking back over time from previous iterations of our American Values Atlas. So just let me talk briefly about the methodology. One of the things that makes this survey so unique and I think powerful is that it involves a lot of Americans being interviewed on a pretty regular basis throughout the year. So the most recent data from 2024 comes from surveys we collected from March through December, and it's really gold standard methodology. Most of the people surveyed are in fact done through a probability sample with a few opt-ins for states that are hard to reach. The upshot here is that we have rich survey data of more than 22,000 Americans with a very low margin of error. And so we're able to really kind of give, I think, a really great overview of Americans' attitudes and at a very accurate and precise level. And we're also, if you go to our website and take a look and play around with some of our data, we actually are able to look at Americans' attitudes on these issues at a 50-state level. And just to acknowledge the funding for this survey is really made possible through generous support from the Arcus Foundation, the Carpenter Foundation, the Gill Foundation, and the Unitarian Universalist Beach Program at Shelter Rock. So I think we wanted to ask one more quick poll while we had you here to get a sense of the percentage of Americans you all think currently support same-sex marriage. I think the consensus from the people that watched was pretty close to what our data finds with respect to LGBTQ Americans and their presence in the US population. 10% is what we find in our American Values Atlas. But let's take a look at what you think when it comes to Americans' attitudes on same-sex marriage. What we find is that 67% of Americans support same-sex marriage, in fact. But let's take a look at the actual data in terms of time series data here. So what we have found since we've asked Americans about marriage equality from about a decade ago in 2014, that we've seen a gradual rise in support among Americans for support for same-sex marriage. In 2014, about a little more than half of Americans supported same-sex marriage. Of course, we know in 2015, Obergefell was decided, which legalized marriage equality in all 50 states. Our most recent data, if you look at the end, really shows that 67% of Americans support same-sex marriage, so more than 2/3. And there's really been gradual support and increase for same-sex marriage, I think, since over the past decade. A little bit of perhaps stagnation or kind of not much changing in the last couple of years. But I think what's really notable is that you see a partisan divide on this issue. This is a theme you'll see in the other slides that we put together today. And so back a decade ago, you had about a 30-point percentage partisan split between Republicans and Democrats with respect to support for same-sex marriage. It's now about 33% in terms of that split. Notably, though, we see increased support among both Democrats and Republicans with respect to support for same-sex marriage. I think is really important to kind of keep in mind. Another thing that we ask Americans about routinely is their support for non-discrimination laws when it comes to protections for LGBTQ people with respect to securing jobs, housing, those sorts of things. And we find really high levels of support among the American public. 75%, 3/4 of Americans say that there should be discrimination laws that protect LGBTQ American people, non-discrimination laws rather. Again, we see a growing divide among partisans, but even here, a solid majority of Republicans, 62%, support non-discrimination protections. But of course, we see it at much higher levels for Democrats. The final question we've asked about routinely in the past decade comes to religiously based service refusals. This is an area, of course, of a lot of litigation. Should, for example, a baker not be allowed to bake a cake for a same-sex couple in terms of a wedding, or a web designer not be able to provide that sort of service? And so we've asked Americans whether they support or oppose allowing small business owners to refuse those protections if it violates their religious beliefs. And on here, we see when it comes to opposition to that, really not much has changed with respect to American public opinion over the past decade. We're still seeing about 58% would oppose that. However, Democrats are far more likely to oppose those religiously based service refusals than Republicans. And again, there's growing polarization by the parties on this particular issue. We have two more slides that really get more into some of what you've been reading about in the news, especially with respect to the recent Scrimity decision. We've asked Americans about whether they support or oppose laws that would restrict gender affirming care for minors. We know, of course, Scrimity upheld a Tennessee law that prohibits parents from getting access to gender affirming care for their minor children. What we found here, unlike, say, support for marriage equality or non-discrimination protections more broadly, the American public, I think, is more divided when it comes to these sorts of issues here. And we've seen really over the last 3 years, a small but somewhat perceptible decrease in opposition to these laws. Even among Democrats, a slight decrease here, certainly among Republicans. But again, Democrats feel very differently on this issue than do Republicans currently. Finally, I wanted to end on a slide that taps into some findings we had with respect to a recent survey we put out, Trump's first 100 days survey. We kind of did a larger analysis of where Americans were on various policies here, but we did want to ask about a couple of issues with respect to transgender rights in the US. One thing that's really notable on the broader principle of supporting equal rights for transgender people, because I think that's where a lot of conversation has been happening, and we're doing a lot of thinking about whether Americans are more supportive of rights for lesbian, gay, bisexual Americans, or trans folks and non-binary folks in a different category. I think it's pretty remarkable that 7 in 10 Americans support equal rights for transgender people, to kind of remove the transgender and specifically ask about that in a question. But oftentimes the devil is often in the details when you ask about specific policies. And so we found, for example, only 38% of Americans, but nearly 2/3 of Democrats oppose bathroom restrictions based on birth sex. We've seen, of course, among Republicans, there's very, very little support, or actually, yeah, little support for opposing those sorts of bills. This is a very different political situation than where we found ourselves even a decade ago, when state legislatures such as that in North Carolina, really politically, were poised to change their policy with respect to requiring individuals to use the bathroom of the gender or sex that they were assigned at birth. And so again, I leave on this data point really to show you, maybe when we come to transgender rights more broadly, there's large support, but when we come to some specific policies, we see, I think, more variance of public opinion. Okay, so that's just a general overview of our findings at PRRI. I'd encourage the audience, I'm guessing many of you are familiar with our work, but we have a lot more research when it comes to an array of questions on LGBTQ rights and issues. But I asked Orion here in part because I think he's just one of the best reporters out there in the field covering LGBTQ rights and politics. But I wanted to start with him before we turn to our other panelists, for him to really sort of lay the groundwork politically in what we're finding with respect to the status of laws that are happening with respect to LGBTQ rights.
Thank you so much, Melissa. So an overview on where LGBTQ rights are right now is, over the past 5 years, we've seen an explosion in state level anti-LGBTQ laws. A lot of these are focused on transgender youth. Can they use the bathrooms in schools? Can kids in schools learn about LGBTQ issues? Can trans kids play in sports that match their gender? And then these state laws have evolved over time to become broader and more extreme, although a lot of them have not gone into law because state advocates have very aggressively fought them, including in states like Texas and Florida especially. But we've seen these state laws get more extreme over time in the sense of what they want to achieve. And one of the broad strokes things they want to achieve is to enforce traditional ideas about sex, traditional ideas about gender, which includes defining sex based on reproductive capacity, which can exclude women who cannot have children. And that's where we start to see these laws get broader in ways that can have unintended consequences. And now we're under the second Trump administration, and we see the administration using a lot of this language in the executive orders that we saw at the beginning of the year. Many of the executive orders, including the day one orders, were focused on trans people, including the order that, kind of vaguely says in the administration's view, there's only men and women in terms of gender and sex. And what we've seen this year, in the last 6 months, we've seen federal agencies try to enforce that vague idea that the administration has put forth. And that's where we're seeing these NIH grants get cut, research into transgender health, which has now been reversed per court order. That's where we see efforts to erase LGBTQ history, like Stonewall, a very basic part of LGBTQ history, changed on the National Park Service website. So that's kind of the broad strokes of where we're at, just in terms of the politics, the laws that we're seeing, and what federal agencies under Trump are trying to put into practice, which is the Trump administration's viewpoint that trans people do not exist. And then also LGBTQ people more broadly, gay parents have a lot of questions in terms of what will the Trump administration do for IVF, for queer parents trying to have kids. We're still waiting for the Trump administration to follow through on an IVF executive order. So some, would-be queer parents are worried what that will look like. We're also seeing HIV/AIDS funding cut internationally, which can also affect people domestically here in the States. So that's kind of a broad strokes situation of what we're looking at politically.
Thank you very much, Orion. That was a very good, I think, illustration of the challenges that we're seeing with respect to LGBT rights. And I think from my perspective as a researcher, and I think maybe Andrew and Kelsy probably agree, the data, the lack of data, and the disappearing of certain data when it comes to health measures and all sorts of things, the history of LGBT Americans is particularly, I think, troubling. But I want to turn first to the question of marriage equality. As I stated before, we know that Obergefell turns 10 this year. This is, of course, the Supreme Court decision that really made it a constitutional right for same-sex couples to marry. We see new challenges to that with respect to some certain red state legislatures, in fact, passing laws that are calling on the Supreme Court to reverse Obergefell. We saw just last week that the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, actually called for the court to repeal and to put forth efforts to start the repealing of same-sex marriage, kind of similar to their strategy for Roe, right? The overturning of Roe. So given all of that, I wanted to ask our panelists, and maybe I'll start with Andrew here and then move over to Kelsy. Is there a sense that what you're finding in the data, do you foresee, for example, any sort of collapse in support for same-sex marriage, maybe among particular groups or marriage equality more generally? And what might be explaining that? I think we saw certainly, maybe it's kind of our data showing it's kind of, the attitudes about marriage equality are sort of stabilized, but I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, are you seeing anything else in the data that we should think about when it comes to marriage equality?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I do agree with you about like the way that attitudes have kind of stabilized, where it's kind of like you're not seeing a growth in support as much as you've seen in the past. But I think that it's also important to kind of realize that the amount of attitude change that we've seen over the course of 2 decades is really unprecedented. It's like there are very few issues that have actually shifted public opinion in such a regard. And so maybe the stabilization is kind of a demographic kind of trend versus that people are really becoming more anti-marriage equality. However, I will also add the warning that there is this kind of transference of this anti-transgender movement and how that is spreading to other LGBTQ issues. So across the board, we've seen across data, PRRI data, as well as others, that attitudes have become more soured around LGBTQ issues. And so, yeah, there is a concern about kind of what is stable change and then versus what is kind of, malleable change. And I think that the public, it's bad to assume that public opinion can be stable and that people's attitudes can change and they can change, and it's not a one-way ratchet. It's going to be in either direction. So I think it's really important for the movement to kind of pay attention to kind of how it's addressing LGBTQ rights broadly, and then how it addresses it on various issues.
That's a really good observation, Andrew, this idea of malleable versus stable change. I would say too that I think when it comes to transgender rights and the debates that we're having, they've also influenced broader perceptions about gender, more generally, So for example, we ask here at PRI quite a bit, are Americans too soft and feminine, right? And the partisans have really sort of, they've always been, I think, polarized on that issue, as you can imagine, Republicans being more conservative on an issue like that. But we've seen really, I think in the last few years, even more of a hardening of a position when it comes to this idea that US society or American society is too soft and feminine. But I do see your point there that to what extent, has the, I think, political debate surrounding transgender and the kind of the almost weaponization of that by some, has that had a broader influence on rights more broadly? Kelsy, I just want to bring you into the conversation also as someone who studies public opinion and Americans' views on marriage equality. What would you add to that? Do you think why we're seeing what we're seeing in public opinion? Do you have concerns potentially that we might see more of a malleable shift in public opinion when it comes to marriage equality in the near future?
I think the issues that you're raising have to do with what's the relationship between the law and people's attitudes, like chicken and egg, what comes first. One of the things that we can observe from PRRI data is that those groups that have led the charge against marriage equality, so Republicans and white evangelicals, their levels of support of same-sex marriage today are much higher than they were in 2014, the year before Obergefell. So we haven't yet seen, even as we see some states and political leaders start talking about, some religious denominations start talking about walking back marriage equality, we haven't yet seen that play out in the data. I think the other thing I would add is that it can appear from public opinion data that the anti-LGBTQ movement has sort of bounced from one issue to the next, that we've moved away from marriage equality to attacks on trans people. I think from a broader sociological and historical perspective, it's helpful to think about how this has always been sort of the same agenda all along. And Melissa, you raising these questions about the meaning of gender, I think really get at this, that really behind the anti-LGBTQ movement is a promotion of very clear ideas about what it means to be male and female, that these are mutually exclusive binary categories that depend upon heterosexuality. So if it appears that the public has changed attitudes when it comes to marriage equality, then it is easy to shift to a new target of transgender people, but really it's the same agenda all along. Oh, you're muted, Melissa.
Thank you. I think that's a really good way kind of to think about these issues. Orion, just to close the loop on marriage equality, in your reporting, what are you getting a sense of? Like I have read some really in the 19th a lot, but I've read really that there might be a movement to either try to formally get the Supreme Court to consider overturning Obergefell, or there's a rise in things like covenant marriages in some red states that are trying to kind of codify it once again, a special form of marriage just for between one man and one woman. So from your perspective, what are you seeing on the ground in terms of marriage equality in the politics?
Absolutely. We've seen more states, including this year and last year, especially red states or states with with the Republican controlled legislature, try to repeal the marriage equality Supreme Court ruling. And what's interesting about Obergefell, or why some advocates have been worried about this recently, is because if the Supreme Court ruling were hypothetically to go away, then marriage equality would go back to the states. And plenty of states without having to change any laws or still have in like their state constitution or like laws on the books that ban same-sex marriage. So that's another piece of this about why this has been concerning to advocates, is because without the Supreme Court ruling, a lot of states wouldn't really have to do anything to restrict same-sex marriage. And just to y'all's point about what Americans are thinking about this issue, obviously PRRI is where I go first. I also look at Gallup, and the last time I looked at Gallup's polling on this, they found that Republican support for same-sex marriage right now is the lowest it's been since 2016 after the Obergefell decision, just for Republicans. So that's something that I've also just been thinking about, which I think is related to what y'all are discussing of how people are viewing or supporting LGBTQ rights.
That's an interesting point on the Gallup data there. One of the things that's really been interesting, I study the politics of Generation Z, younger Americans, is we have seen a little bit of a decline in support for marriage equality among young people. What's notable, I think, are two things. One, empirically, a lot of that's really a function of younger Republicans becoming more conservative overall. And I think there's often this assumption that younger people will moderate the politics of the Republican Party when it comes to issues like marriage equality. Although, as Andrew and Kelsy point out, we've still seen some gradual increase in support among Republicans for marriage equality. But among younger people, that's a really interesting dynamic that I think we need to be paying attention to. But I think the other thing, and we don't have, unfortunately, the time or space right now to ask this on a survey, but something to consider in the future. Younger Americans are just completely distrustful of most institutions in America. And I'm wondering too, if it's more that they're just not happy about marriage, like marriage rates have really declined among younger people. So I'm wondering if that's an element of it that maybe we could put some more thought into as we move forward as researchers.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Melissa. Like many of my undergrads don't really believe in democratic institutions anymore. Like traditional structures are just not where people feel like they can get the change that people promise them. And so it's kind of, and it's also gendered. So like there's a big gender divide in like women's engagement in politics and men's engagement in politics among Gen Z. And so, and like the educational divide is there as well. And so it's just, we're at a weird point in terms of where the generational change is going to happen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrea. I think that point is really, really valid. And it's fun hearing from, not fun, but it's interesting to hear from my friends in academia, like what they're seeing on the ground level with, college educated students at least, and they're really shifting opinions on all of these issues. I want to circle back, though, for a minute to talk about the Scrimeti decision, which was handed down last week. A lot of court watchers were looking with a lot of interest because this was really the first time that the court had heard a decision about restricting medical care, in this case for minors. So they upheld a Tennessee law that restricted those access to gender-affirming care for minors. So I'm just kind of curious, maybe Kelsy, I know you're someone writing this larger book about sort of the movement to sort of block transgender rights. So why do you think we're at this moment now? And what do you think it portends in the future? And again, I ended with that slide looking at this idea that most Americans in principle say that we shouldn't discriminate against transgender Americans, but yet we have differences of opinions when it comes to specific policies. So I've set you up for far too long, so I'm just going to hand it over to you for some of your thoughts on where we are now.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I think we are in this interesting historical moment, and to contextualize it, one of the things that proponents of laws like Tennessee's that ban gender affirming care for minors, that they suggest is that these medical treatments are new, that, sort of trans identity is this brand new thing that developed in the 90s, when in fact we've had these medical treatments around for a very long time, for well over 100 years. We can think about the 1950s and the 1960s being an era when Americans really started paying attention to what was called at the time sex change operations, with the emergence of celebrities like Christine Jorgensen, universities across the country that opened clinics that provided what we now call gender affirming care. And back at that time, there was not widespread political mobilization in opposition to this kind of healthcare. There was disagreement and debates among clinicians, among professionals who were providing the care. There would be certainly some disputes, letters to the editors written into newspapers who covered these stories, but there wasn't this mass mobilization that we've seen today. So I think as a sociologist, I'm really interested in answering the question of why we have seen this change. And one of the things that I think is important to highlight is that even though proponents of laws that oppose rights for transgender people talk about this as kind of a grassroots movement, that, you know, they're responding to the concerns of parents or other concerned citizens, that this is really a targeted campaign that's coming from the top down. Orion already mentioned the Trump administration's, you know, on Inauguration Day, we get these executive orders. We see that, I think it's something like 40% of political ads, the commercials that came out in the weeks leading up to the election, targeted transgender people. We see national political organizations that are really putting money and resources into this campaign. So this is not a grassroots from the ground up effort of mobilization, but really one that has been intentionally curated by the conservative movement.
Andrew, did you want to add in here in terms of your sense of, as someone who has studied, you know, public opinion on these issues, why do you think we're at the state where we are when it comes to transgender rights? And is there any sort of nuance we can think about when it comes to looking at American attitudes on transgender rights? Is it just a specific, the Skirmity case, of course, involving minors? Is it just, I don't know, just a general sense from your perspective as someone who studies public opinion, why we're currently voting?
Yeah. So, well, what we've learned with PRRI data, as well as many other data sources, is basically that the states have polarized, that public opinion is not clear across the geographic board. And on issues where it comes to transgender rights, when it comes to topics that involve, say, like transgender bodies, so like the medical care or sports or locker rooms, that people think about those issues differently than when they think about like transgender civil rights. And for some reason, there is this great divide in how much people think that discrimination on that civil rights dimension is actually discrimination. And people are actually really supportive of transgender rights when they think about it that way. But when they think about it on this other dimension, this other axis that is basically where people are thinking about where transgender minors getting medical care, they are not as supportive in that regard. And the interesting thing is that people have thought about this issue in that way, or like transgender rights in this way, since like 2014. Like we've found this in the data across the board. And so it's important to kind of think about like what mind are people approaching, say, transgender rights with? And then how is that translating into their policy opinions? And so, you know, so it's more, at least to me, it's more complicated than it is with, say, marriage equality, in the sense that it's the same topics that get brought up, but how do you shift one's perspective from thinking with these concerns versus thinking that this is discrimination? So, and that's the puzzle.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We haven't asked here at PRI about this, but I do know, I think I've seen some polling suggesting that most Americans, for example, are unhappy about the Trump administration's decision to remove transgender soldiers from the U.S. Army, right? There's a sense that, look, these folks are willing to serve their country. They've done great work. This is just discriminatory behavior. And so I think that gets at that kind of divide that you're speaking about. And as researchers trying to figure out how to ask those questions, I think can be sort of challenging in the environment. I want to end before we turn to some questions from the audience on the idea of sort of what's happening at the executive level when it comes to definitions of gender. I sort of talked a bit about this, and Kelsy earlier, I think, had some really thoughtful commentary there. But maybe, Orion, from your reporting, is there a sense that the efforts by the Trump administration, for example, to define gender as just, you know, female and male based on biology, is that something that is striking a chord with most Americans? Are they not aware of it? I mean, what's kind of been the political reception to the efforts by the Trump administration to really sort of, I think, try to have this declaration of what gender and how it should be defined?
Thank you so much, Melissa. I think this actually goes to one of the questions we got in the chat. I think one of the best examples here, we saw whenever the Trump campaign spent nearly 20 million on anti-trans TV ads for their political campaign. there's no evidence that I've seen that these ads got people to vote, that it changed their vote. Like the mobilization or likelihood to vote, we don't know that. But we do know from ground media, they put out a randomized control trial back in 2024. They found that viewers to these ads were more likely to support policies restricting trans access to healthcare. They found a reduced comfortability with accepting a trans friend or family member. So we don't know about the changes in their voting patterns, but we do know that these ads had an effect on what people think about trans people, and that matters. And then when we think about why is the Trump administration so focused on this, I think there's a couple reasons for that. And something that stands out to me are, kind of some of Trump's off-the-cuff comments and his cabinet or his administration's off-the-cuff comments. There's been some instances where Trump is asked about immigration and he brings up trans people, or where Donald Trump Jr. is responding to a statement about a mass shooting and he brings up trans people. We're seeing the Trump administration bring up this topic when it's not related to anything. We've also seen Trump, I forget if this was an on-camera interview or in a published story, it's probably on camera. But he made an off-the-cuff comment about like, I'm paraphrasing, but he was like, I'll save my thoughts about this trans issue when we're up to re-election again. Because to the administration, this is a way to gin up excitement or controversy, attention. Like it doesn't even have to be about, will people vote for us? Although obviously the way they framed these campaign ads was, Kamala's for they, them, and we're for you. The framing of that campaign ad is to other trans people to make it seem like supporting trans people has nothing to do with, the real issues of the day. So it's questionable whether that is a strategy that's working in the way they want it to, or if it's just making more people hate trans people or not understand them. And then I would also, whenever we're talking about this area, I would also look back to Project 2025, because we've seen, and Project 2025 was the Heritage Foundation's blueprint, their policy recommendations for the Trump administration. The administration does not have to implement any of it. It was just like the recommendations, although plenty of administration officials helped to write it. But Project 2025, it envisioned a federal government that, denies the existence of trans people, that undermines the rights of same-sex married couples, and dismantle services for LGBTQ Americans wherever possible. So whenever we're looking at why does the administration do this, why do they bring this up, I think we can look to, how they discuss the issue, their campaign ads, and then what were they being advised policy-wise by groups like the Heritage Foundation? It was to be as extreme as possible on LGBTQ issues.
Thanks, Orion. We actually only have about 6 minutes left. I'm not sure how that happened, but I did want to kind of point to 2 questions that were raised in the Q&A feature, and then also kind of as a way to sort of circle back to these ideas about questions we should be asking, things I've thought about in my own research. But one question asked about, says the following: with Christian nationalism questions, PRRI found that the language and beliefs around those constructs differs by race and religious affiliation. Do we see similar differences in language and beliefs around sexuality and gender by race and religious affiliation? And the short answer is yes, we do. Certainly, we've tended, for example, when it comes to issues of support for non-discrimination, we find that people of color tend to be more supportive of that. And I think that probably is rooted in their own experiences feeling discrimination. But there's also, I think, an intersection when it comes to race and religion as well. Just to give you one example, there's a divide among Hispanic Catholics and Hispanic Protestants on a lot of these issues, with Hispanic Protestants being more conservative. So it's important to kind of bear that in mind, I think, as well. But I would encourage the viewers to go to our website. Our last report really has all those breaks very specifically in looking at a lot of these attitudes with respect to religious affiliation and race. I would also just say this too. I often try to remind people when it comes to issues such as marriage equality or non-discrimination protections, most people of faith tend to be broadly supportive of those kinds of efforts there. Now, of course, there are religious distinctions. Evangelicals tend to be more conservative on these issues, but generally speaking, I think there's a lot of support actually among people of faith in this country. The second point here, some of these PRRI survey results really seem to mirror the talking points bannered about on conservative and social media. How influential are these venues in influencing opinions? I think this is a $1 million question. We have looked at, for example, at PRRI, we found a clear connection between Americans who watch Fox News or more conservative leaning news outlets and their attitudes on a variety of positions when it comes to cultural issues such as LGBTQ issues. Like they tend to be far more conservative, which is not surprising. I think the challenge as researchers, and maybe I'm going to throw it to Andrew and Kelsy here for their thoughts on this, is really trying to harness new media. Like legacy media is dying. Younger people are not watching television news. They're looking at YouTube, they're on TikTok, all these sorts of things. And so finding that kind of causal connection between what people are viewing and what their attitudes are, I think is something that is not as well established and needs more research. So I don't know, Andrew and Kelsy, if you want to give your thoughts on sort of how social media and these new forms of media might be influencing and shaping people's opinions.
Well, I don't know if I have data on like social media, but I can tell you that entertainment media, so like just getting information from John Oliver or other sources, does change minds and really does kind of move the needle on many of these issues. Um, and I don't want to derail Kelsy, but I did want to comment on Skermeti a little bit and just say how much the majority opinion kind of skirted a lot of the issues to kind of come to its conclusion, right? It's like, this is not sex discrimination. That's how, I don't know how, but this is age, and age is fine to discriminate against, right? And then this is not transgender discrimination, right? Like the majority opinion shows that the court and the conservatives on the court are not aligned on the idea that, discriminating against trans people is wrong. And there's actually disagreement there. But Kelsy, I'll let you go.
Yeah, let me see if I can tie it all together. Okay, so I think this is a really important question, which is basically what is the responsibility of research firms like PRRI in asking questions that might actually align with conservative media's talking points? I think the fact is that there's a right-wing media ecosystem that there is no parallel or analogy on the left that is sort of operating at every level, from social media and influencers all the way up to legacy media. So that's something that I think progressives have to contend with. I mean, one of the questions Melissa asked us to think about is what questions should PRRI be asking? And I think here's where I'll tie it back to what Andrew was talking about with Skermeti. One of these issues before the court was the fact that Tennessee's law actually allows medical treatments like puberty blockers and hormone therapies for cisgender kids, for non-trans kids that could be prescribed this medication. And one of the things that I think is totally absent from public opinion polls is, what do people think about that? What do people think about non-trans kids getting access to these medical treatments that the anti-trans movement is framing as risky and experimental? So that's one opportunity. I think the other opportunity is when it comes to, Melissa, your question about how has gender become this boogeyman, and Orion, you sort of walk through the ways in which the Trump administration is using transgender people as a way to sort of deflect, real challenges and social problems. And I'd be curious, one of the things that's missing in so many federal documents about gender or gender ideology is a clear definition of what that exactly is. And so I'm very curious what might the American public think this refers to? Because it's, much like critical race theory or these other wedge issues that are thrown about, we don't have really a clear, robust definition by political administrations, by activists, political leaders. So I'd be really curious where the American public lands in terms of what that means to them.
Kelsy, I think that's a terrific way to end the webinar. We're at 2:15. I would really encourage folks, there's so many more resources on our website at PRRI. We have a new, in fact, a terrific updated website where you can go and look under LGBTQ and you'll see spotlight analyses, reports, and also look to Andrew and Kelsey's pages on there. You'll learn more about their own research as well. So please do that. And Orion, thank you for joining us today. I think your comments and your knowledge about what's happening was really, really useful. And please follow Orion at the 19th as well. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.